Good morning. Welcome to the SCOTA Coffee Hour with the title of What's Really Happening on the Border Today, Eyewitness Report. SCOTA is a issue committee of Women Against Military Madness. And we have been doing coffee hours, trying to do them monthly, although there was a hiatus during COVID, but we have now resumed monthly coffee hours. SCOTA educates about the role of U.S. foreign policy in the military and economic oppression and intervention throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. SCOTA is action-oriented, focusing on challenging U.S. hegemonic policies in the region and supporting the right of self-determination for all. We will promote and participate in emergency demonstrations in response to U.S. economic and military incursions in the Americas. And we will work with many local and national organizations focusing on areas within the Americas. I will put the information about SCOTA meetings and the number to call to receive a link to join a meeting in the chat. And we also have a email, Solidarity Committee of Americas at gmail.com. I'll put that email also in the chat. The list, we have many co-hosts for which we are grateful, and they include Hands Off Honduras, Haiti Justice Committee, MIRAC, Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, Climate Justice Committee, Anti-War Committee, Minnesota Caravan Solidarity, Minnesota Cuba Committee, Raise the Welfare Grants in Minnesota, Eastside Freedom Library, and Veterans for Peace, Chapter 27, and Twin Cities Hands Off Venezuela, Move for Justice News, and Witness for Peace Midwest. And so we do have the coffee hours to explore and learn about various issues in Latin America. I'm going to read the WAM land acknowledgement statement. Badote is a Dakota word that generally means where two waters come together. The Badote, where Hahatanka, River of the Waterfall, or Wakpatanka, Big River, called the Mississippi River in English, and the Minnesota Wakpa Minnesota River come together is central to Dakota spirituality and history. Badote is a place that carries a complicated and layered history in the thousands of years the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here, and in the several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies. The United States land seizures were a project of spiritual destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to the land that fundamentally shapes their identity and spirituality. So we invite you to consider where you stand and the land that we all occupy at this time. On the website under About Us, on the WAM website under About Us, there is also a list of resources that you can use to connect with various Native organizations. And so thank you very much for that. And Marcy is going to introduce our speakers.
Hey, good morning. And I'm Marcy Shapiro, and I'm also a member of SCOTA. I wanted to let you know that Penny is not hiding. We've been having some Zoom problems this morning, and she's not able to have the video on her account. So she's there, even though you don't see her. Hopefully she will pop up at some point. So we're really excited this morning to have two great speakers, but I want to start by telling you that one of our speakers, who's not here, Isabel Garcia, is unable to be here with us today. And Isabel is faced with a serious family medical situation, and she had to back out at the last minute. But she was wonderful, and she found us our second speaker, Pedro Rios, and so we will be we're looking forward to hearing from him. So I just want to introduce the two speakers, and then maybe the way we're going to do it is Penny and I are going to rotate asking a question to each of them, or to both of them, and then ask them to answer the question in however way they want to. So Eduardo Garcia, who is called Lalo, is an activist and photojournalist born in Mexico City. His work has been primarily focused on the struggle of indigenous peoples in Mexico, Central America, and Central American migration, forced disappearances, and social movements in Latin America. And Pedro Rios is the director of the American Friends Service Committee U.S.-Mexico Border Program, and has worked for American Friends Service Committee since 2003. He oversees a program that documents abuses by law enforcement agencies, collaborates with community groups, advocates for policy changes, and works with migrant communities to build collective leadership locally and throughout the border region. Pedro has a master's degree in ethnic studies from San Francisco State University, and he is also a photographer and writer. So we will begin with the questions. And why don't, Eduardo, you go first, and then Pedro, and then you can maybe rotate on the questions. So Penny, you go first.
All right, so our first question is, please tell us about your last trip to the border and what is really happening at the border now.
Hello, everyone. It is a real honor to be with you all today. So I live in Tucson, Arizona. So this is not a border city, like it could be Tijuana and San Diego, but at the end of the day, Tucson is still part of the border in different ways. So I also want to acknowledge that, as you read in my bio, I'm not a Tucsonian and I'm not a Tohono O'odham person. So I want just to disclaim that all my comments come from an organizer and come from an outsider perspective at the end of the day. And there is different folks that have been fighting this long fight for way more time than I've been doing this. So just wanted to honor and respect that. And with that in mind, I would also like to say that I would like to invite people to start thinking of the border not only in terms of the line that divides the United States and Mexico, but the lines that surround the United States. And I'm saying this because at the end of the day, the United States, like 80% of United States population live under border patrol policies, live under borderlands policies. So I think it is important to acknowledge this, because even when most of the violence, or we are seeing tons of violence in the US-Mexico border, the violence of DHS and Border Patrol impacts communities everywhere, impacts communities all over the country. As you may know, the Border Patrol has access and can basically has tons of power 100 miles from the border, but basically the ACLU has said that all this area where Border Patrol have tons of influence is called the non-constitution land, basically saying that Border Patrol can do whatever they want. And this not only refers to the US-Mexico border, again, this refers to the whole country. And just wanted to mention this because I think media can be misled us around those issues, and just center the conversation around this area. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to say that the situation in the borderlands is really difficult, and it changes from one place to another. At least in the Ambos Nogales area, like the border that divides Sonora and Arizona, um, the situation is really complicated. We are seeing tons of people coming to the with the intention to cross to the United States, and there is people that is also trying to cross without following like or without asking for asylum. The situation is so bad in the border that people is just trying to cross to the United States. The situation is so bad that we're still seeing tons of families coming to the border. We're seeing tons of children coming to the border, but not as the big influx that's like bigger media outlets have been trying to tell us. Like nothing, like at least in this area of the border, nothing has changed much. But we're seeing like a continuation of what was happening before, like Biden as got power or became president. So something that we're seeing as well is just like an arrival of tons of children to this area. And again, hasn't changed sporadically, or this hasn't changed that drastically since Biden became president as well. So the situation again is really hard, and I just also wanted to acknowledge that the border as itself is not like a unified entity, and the situation that can be happening in Arizona and Tucson in particular could be really different from other places in the country. So I'm just going to leave it there because I think it's like a really broad question that can be specified and clarified in the next part of the conversation.
So I think I'll go now. Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Penny, and thank you, Eduardo. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. In terms of the border, I live in the city of Chula Vista, which is the second largest city in San Diego County. I'm probably about 5 miles or less from the actual U.S.-Mexico border. I go to Tijuana on a regular basis. Primarily, I visit what is known as the Chaparral encampment, which formed in late February, shortly after President Biden announced that migrants that were registered under MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as the Return to Mexico program, were going to begin being processed again. And consequently, what that led to was that many people that were expecting to present themselves for an asylum claim started showing up at the Chaparral area, that's the port of entry, with the idea that they also would receive news about how to get processed, how to make a claim for asylum. And the first day, which was around February 18th, and then the next day, which is Friday, February 19th, there were maybe around 200 people that ultimately gathered together. As of yesterday, there are approximately 2,000 people that are there, where there are many tents that have sprung up that house family units of between 2 to 8 people. All of the people there are waiting to receive any sort of information. I would say around more than 99% or around 99% don't qualify for MPP because they were not on the MPP program. And many of them have been in Tijuana for and in Mexico for maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years. And then there are also some recent arrivals, both that are from countries other than Mexico, and then people who are IDPs or internally displaced people. One of the problems that I see is that what I mentioned before is that there's a lack of information, and that has been left to civil society groups to provide information about where people stand. Before the pandemic started, several years ago, back in 2016, about 5 years ago, both the U.S. and Mexican authorities started an illegal list that then got replicated in other parts of the border. This was the arrival of people who would then write their names on the list. When it became apparent that the U.S. and Mexican authorities were doing this, they were challenged, and it was called an illegal list. And so they sort of washed their hands of it and passed it over to the migrants themselves. So the migrants themselves have been writing their names on the list, and it's based on this list that they get called to appear at the port of entry. So at the start of the pandemic, this list stops. And so many of these individuals that did not qualify for the MPP were being metered. And this was the effect of this list was that they were getting metered, which meant that they got called when their number was up to appear at the port of entry. I found out yesterday by a meeting that took place with Customs and Border Protection and other DHS officials that this likely will be irrelevant once U.S. authorities start taking in people who are presenting themselves at the port. And so we're talking about a list that's around 6,000 people long or more only in Tijuana. It could be longer or shorter in other places along the border. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, a lot of desperation. Along with that, the fact that President Biden continues the application of the Title 42 order, which is the CDC order from many, many years ago that essentially says under a pandemic, the U.S. can expel people from the United States if they are without status. And under the Trump administration, racist advisors essentially use this as a way to expel brown and black migrants. And so it was specifically targeting migrants that were coming in. And so, for instance, black migrants from Haiti, migrants from Africa, did not qualify for the MPP program because they weren't Spanish speaking. And so many of them have been in Tijuana for a number of years. And so now under Title 42, if they attempt to cross into the U.S., they will be expelled without due process rights being observed for them. Consequently, what this has led to is that many families are doing something that they're calling la autoseparación. So while under the Trump administration, zero tolerance policy was instituted, and now the Biden administration has removed the zero tolerance policy, we still have the self-separation or autoseparación that families are doing, because if they cross together, they will be likely expelled back to Mexico or to their home countries. And so many of them are making a very difficult choice of saying, well, if we send our children by themselves, then at least they will be safeguarded in the U.S. And so the increase of unaccompanied minors in part has to do with the continued application of the Title 42 CDC order that the Biden administration has kept, which we know is a racist policy that was put in place by Stephen Miller from the former Trump administration. So this has led to different sorts of things that are taking place. Border Patrol is transferring a lot of families from the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, to San Diego. There are approximately around 135 people per day that were being flown to San Diego. 100 people of those 135 were being expelled, and then 35 of those 135 mostly were being allowed to be processed through what is known as a Title 8 order, another order under the INA Act, the Immigration Act. And so there are a lot of different situations that are taking place because the desperation has now created a situation where people are attempting to cross through much more dangerous ways. And so just in the San Diego sector, for instance, and the California border, we've seen border deaths increase from people falling from the border wall and dying, trying to swim around the border wall that goes into the Pacific Ocean at the westernmost edge of the U.S.-Mexico border. There have been 2 drownings there. Just last weekend, there was a boat that tore apart and 3 migrants drowned and died. And so the number of deaths has increased as a result of what we could say the continued militarization process of urban centers, of border areas, but also the frustration that Title 42 has caused because it leaves people with little room to present themselves at the court. And so we can talk a little bit more about this as the questions continue. Thank you.
Thank you. When Eduardo talked about that the whole country is affected by the border, I think we have to keep remembering that Minnesota, where for most of us are, has a border. And it's been a border where people cross it illegally as well as legally. So it is, I think we need to think of ourselves as a border community, just like all the communities along the southern border are border communities. So thanks for bringing that up here in Minnesota. So I think we're going to move on to the next question, which is, we wanted you to describe the Northern Triangle countries, telling us about which countries they are, what the conditions are in those countries that cause people to migrate, that they're the root of the migration, and what's the role of the U.S. in creating the situation in the Northern Triangle countries. So, which of you want to start? How about Eduardo? Why don't you start with that? Nope.
Sure. Yeah. Or Pedro, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah.
That's fine. I can start and then.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. So the Northern Triangle typically refers to 3 countries, which are Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And these are countries that for decades have borne the brunt of unfair, unjust U.S. foreign policies. And in some cases, more recently, for instance, if we look at the case of Honduras, where the U.S. Supported the ousting of democratically elected Manuel Zelaya back in 2010, that created a lot of instability in that particular country. And typically what happens when the U.S., through its foreign policy, meddles in other countries, it creates a lot of destabilization. It allows for criminal operations and networks to essentially establish parallel corrupt governments, which we've seen in many places. In fact, although the issue here, the question is around the Northern Triangle, we've seen in the San Diego sector that there has been many more people that are coming from Venezuela, people that are coming from Brazil. There are a lot of Cubans that have arrived, and as I mentioned, and Haitians are still arriving. And as I mentioned earlier, people from different African countries have been arriving in this place as in the region as well. And so, there's corruption by governments. If we look at Mexico itself, having had a conversation with a woman from Michoacan a few weeks ago, what she was telling me is that, her family was targeted by a local gang. The father attempted to defend his 2 young teenagers, and then he was beaten and almost disabled. And so they, from one day to the next, they had to leave Michoacan and they arrived to Tijuana, and they had been there for maybe 3 months. And so what the mother told me is the same cartel groups that are in Michoacan are here in Tijuana. So I have no choice but to try to get my children across, even if it means separating myself from them. So there's a lot of state violence. There's a lot of violence from non-state actors, oftentimes that are working with the state. In this case, it might be like members of organized crime groups, working together with the police, for instance. Oftentimes, some of the other reasons that people are forced to migrate, if we go back to like Guatemala, is climate change. And climate change is a real reason why people migrate. Yet in the United States, we're not necessarily having a conversation about how climate change impacts that. So in some places in Guatemala and some places in Honduras, where there's been crops have been impacted by a long-standing drought, the indigenous migrants there or indigenous peoples there have had to become migrants because they can no longer have the crops ready to live sustainable lives or to be able to sell them. And so that forces them to migrate. And in some cases, when they're competing with some of the global corporations that are exploiting the lands and exploiting people there as workers. So there's a lot of that going on. There's very specific violence to targeted groups, a lot of uh, impact that might have to young women, for instance, a lot of trafficking in San Diego. The San Diego area tends to be a high trafficking area of minors and of women in particular, of people who identify with the LGBTQI community. So it's a real impact that plays in terms of how that violence plays out and forces people to migrate.
Thank you so much, Pedro. That was really, really powerful. And I would like to complement or just to continue that conversation and some of the comments you made by saying that I think that's something that is really important for us to acknowledge as people living in the United States, is that for some folks in Central America, well, first of all, they find they're trying to push against this idea of the Northern Triangle, because even when it helps us to identify and and name some of the problems that are going on in Central America, it erases the particular experiences of each country and presents them as a monolith, as if they were like the same. And it is true that they share perspectives and they share stories of repression and violence in many ways. But at the end of the day, each country has its own particular history, and I think like there is folks in Central America trying to push for that history to be recognized. So I understand that this is like a term that we have been using because it's really to use it on media outlets, and we have seen it all over the time, like time after time in like the newspapers or just like the internet and even our conversations. But sometimes I think like the clarification that Pedro made at the beginning, like to say like to name these three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, I think it's just really important, because when we recognize each country individually, we can recognize the history of violence and the responsibility that the United States has had in each country to basically create what we call the root causes of migration. That overall, we see them as like the US intervention in Latin America, the economic, political, and military interventions are the reasons why people are fleeing. And I think that it's also really important for us to acknowledge that all the violence that people is going through in Central America in particular is happening in an era with most cooperation between the United States and Central America. So basically what we are seeing is that the more cooperation, the more the United States is involved, the more violence is present. And for us, that's something that we really want to acknowledge. In the particular case of Honduras, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the situation of violence that we're seeing there is not new, but it's something that it started basically in the 50s when Honduras became the United States military base in Central America. And that happened in many ways because the United States really wanted to protect its interest in the region against the communists, and the United States was so invested in this war against communism that in order to fight and to protect its interests, they literally invaded Honduras and they started killing social leaders and organizers in the region. And from Honduras, we cannot forget that Honduras was the base where the coups in Guatemala or the coups in El Salvador were planned. Honduras was a place were the Contras that were fighting against the Sandinista revolution were trained. The Contras that were trying to fight against the FMLN were also trained. So I think like it's really important for us to remember that, because that will give us clarity to understand how deep the United States is responsible for the crisis we're seeing today. And most recently, Honduras has been, like there was a big. Sí, mi amor. Sorry, my nephew is visiting and they're going outside. But recently, we cannot forget the 2009 US-backed coup in Honduras. That was a coup totally supported by the Obama administration, what was totally supported by Hillary Clinton. And literally, that coup was against a president that was trying to fight against corruption, that was trying to fight against these root causes of migration. And we cannot forget that after that coup, the situation in Honduras got really worse. We cannot forget that the situation in Honduras changed a lot at that moment. And since then, we have the killings of compañeras like Berta Cáceres. We have an increase of violence against Afro-Indigenous communities, in particular the Garifuna communities. And and the governments that have came after the 2009 coup has just deepened this crisis. We cannot forget that in 2017, the electoral crisis, the post-electoral crisis in Honduras, and the number of people that were killed, over 30 people were killed. There were over 1,000 people with charges and with legal cases, but it was around 10,000 people who were detained after that moment. There was, and after the 2017, the number of the political repression increased and the number of people leaving the country increased. So when we talk about the migrant caravans, and it's really important to understand that, or to see, or to acknowledge that many of these caravans start in Honduras. And of course, then people from other countries join, but many of these caravans start in Honduras. And I think it's important to have clarity on why these caravans start in this particular country, So for me, it's or for us, it's really important to see those things in order to understand the situation in the country. In the same way, I think it's important to acknowledge that, and I'm talking about Honduras because we're seeing all this violence, we're seeing all this political repression, and we're seeing how now a U.S. court in New York City is judging Tony Hernandez, Juan Orlando Hernandez's brother. Juan Orlando Hernandez is the president of Honduras. And the United States has been showing the relation between the Honduran government and drug cartels, so with this in mind is what is going on at this moment, that the United States is seeing the Hernandez family as a threat to its interest in the country. I think it's really important to see those things. And again, I'm talking about Honduras because the hurricanes, because of the beginnings of the caravans, etc. And I'm sorry for taking a lot of time in this case, but I just really want to to share some ideas around this. Tons of people talk a lot about the violence in Salvador, or gang violence in general in Central America, and El Salvador is a big name there, right? But for us, it's really important to acknowledge that the gang violence started as a strategy from the United States. There was a situation of war in Central America. Tons of people were pushed to the United States. There were tons of new Central Americans in the United States, and they had to create gangs in order to defend themselves from Mexican gangs and from gangs from other kind of gangs. And the United States, when they saw this was this was becoming a problem, they just decided to deport tons of people back to Central America. And the United States deported all these people to countries where there were no adults, or that were really affected by civil war, they were going through an economic crisis, so etc. So literally the gangs found the perfect place to reproduce themselves and to grow. So I think just wanted to really clarify that, because like the way in which sometimes US media talk about gangs doesn't acknowledge how the United States was really involved in the situation. And also for us, it's really important to understand how the drug violence or like drug cartels in Central America are closely related to the United States as well. We cannot forget that, like during the Contra war in Nicaragua, for example, the DEA was so involved in giving, the control of drug trafficking routes to the Contras, so they can sell these drugs and then they can make money to buy weapons to fight against the Nicaraguan revolution. So basically, like the situation of like drugs in Central America, it's also deeply connected to the United States wars against communism, or the United States, to protect its interests in the country. And what it's really troubling for me, and when I talk about us, I mean, I refer to like the Alliance for Global Justice, that is the organization where I work with, but also with other partners, or I'm talking about the perspective from other partners, is that we are seeing that with Joe Biden, the situation is far from get better. Like we're not seeing a change. It's really important for us to remember that in 2014, when we had the crisis of unaccompanied minors, that actually for people in Mexico, this was not a crisis. This was something that we saw coming. But when we tried to talk to people in the United States, not like organizations, but like government officials, etc., they didn't care about it. But when we saw the situation, like when this was going on, Biden presented the Alliance for Prosperity, as the solution to protect migrants, but also to keep them from coming to the United States. However, something that was really troubling for us was that, Biden was an architect of Plan Colombia, and at that moment, in that particular moment, John Biden compared the transformation needed in Central America to that of Colombia. And I would like to ask you all, like, what's going on in Colombia right now? And literally Biden was using Colombia as an example of like of the success of these policies, So literally, we're following the same formula, and after the implementation of the Alliance of Prosperity in Mexico, we are just seeing like an increase in the militarization of the country in order to stop people coming to the United States, and also we're seeing an increase of violence against not only migrants and refugees, but also against organizers, against leaders, against people trying to stand up in solidarity with immigrant and asylum seekers, And on the other hand, what we found out about the Alliance for Prosperity, and I'm talking about this specific policy or this specific plan because we have a lot of information about it. But at the end of the day, we realized that the centerpiece of the Alliance of Prosperity was not to protect Central American people, was not to protect asylum seekers and migrants. It was literally to construct a new gas pipeline from Salina Cruz, Oaxaca, southern Mexico, to Escuintla, Guatemala. And in order to make this, the United States, or in particular the Alliance for Prosperity, like foresaw like 9 new corridors, and of course, and like it proposed channels for investors to come, But at the end of the day, what this plan really did was just to increase or to like make the conditions worse. I'm going to stop here because we can just keep talking about how deep the United States is involved in like the violence happening in Central America. But in particular, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the United States is not alone in the violence against migrants and refugees, migrants and asylum seekers, but Mexico has been really complicit in all the violence happening there. And Mexico, unfortunately, has become the new U.S. southern border. Like the border between Chiapas and Talisman, or like basically the border between Chiapas state and Mexico and Guatemala is the new U.S. southern border.
Well, thank you very much for that detailed explanation about the origin of the situation. You touched on certainly on the U.S. role on the border. It creates a war zone with the militarization of the border, white supremacy, xenophobia on the border. And could you talk about the behavior of the Border Patrol and the constant surveillance, and address you talked about how deaths have increased due to the war or due to the wall people falling and drowning related to the wall. What is the status of the wall, and is Biden continuing to the construction? And then also the impact on the Tohono O'odham people and other tribes on the border. So you can both take that however you want to divide that question up. Thank you.
Maybe, excuse me, maybe I can talk a little bit about the history of the Border Patrol and some of the prospects that we see under Biden's new plan that he sent to Congress. And so I think, when we talk about the militarization of the border, I like to refer to it as militarization of border communities, just to be able to acknowledge that there are communities that are bearing the brunt of this process of militarization. And this process has gone along for a long time. But the legacy of the Border Patrol is one that really was based on white supremacist ideals going back to its formation in 1924. Many of the Border Patrol recruits back then were members of different militia groups, members of vigilante groups, members of the Texas Rangers, of the Arizona Rangers, that were accustomed to treating Mexicans as people who should be lynched. In fact, there was, the 10 years prior to the formation of the Border Patrol in 1924, there was a period that was known as La Matanza in certain areas in Texas, because these groups, vigilante groups and militia groups and the Texas Rangers regularly and with state authority would lynch Mexicans. And there's a growing body of literature, which is really important, that shows how this was taking place on a much more regular basis. So that legacy of violence, that culture of violence over the years that is based on a white supremacist ideal, gets replicated in different ways in terms of how the Border Patrol continues to act and how it forms into then what later becomes the Customs and Border Protection under the Department of Homeland Security. Many Border Patrol agents behave in a very cavalier attitude, behave as though they are a paramilitary force. In fact, they've described themselves in that way pretty regularly. And there have been former Border Patrol high-ranking officials like David Aguilar, who had the vision of the Border Patrol at one day becoming a national police force. And so with Trump at the helm, when Trump was in office, this started to become much more of the possibility that they were seeking. And so with Border Patrol operating and sending their forces into our urban landscapes when BLM protests were taking place, this was part of that visioning that they had imagined for the Border Patrol to become a national police force and to play a role much beyond just the border areas, 100-mile area that is permitted under jurisdiction of Border Patrol, which they can actually operate beyond that. But that's just what's under regulation. In addition to that, we started seeing that there was a change in how the Border Patrol started presenting themselves in social media. So suddenly, all the sector chiefs of the Border Patrol started getting social media accounts. It was something that was quite troubling because the way they described themselves and their operations and the work they were doing was similar to law enforcement duties. And so here in San Diego at a Black Lives Matter protest, for instance, I saw Border Patrol agents that were dealing with like traffic issues and rerouting traffic to different places. And in some ways, this was violating or circumventing rather the California Values Act, which prevents local resources to be used to support immigration detention issues. And so the pushback that I got from these law enforcement agencies, specifically the Sheriff's Department of San Diego, was that they were not using resources for apprehending people and were not supporting immigration agencies, but in fact, it was Border Patrol that was assisting them with traffic control and other matters that would be assumed to be part of the local law enforcement jurisdiction. But it's not the first time that they've done this. If we go back to the Rodney King situation, the LA riots following the Rodney King beating, we saw, for instance, that's when Border Patrol was used as local law enforcement as well. And as what Eduardo was saying in terms of the deportations of people that were considered to be affiliated with gangs and things like that, that's where the exportation of a lot of the people that were affiliated with gangs went to Central America, and the booming then parallel governments that I talked about of criminal networks started taking place because it was purposefully done in this way to deport people and to separate people and to break apart some of the organizing that was happening in some of the LA areas that were wrought with poverty, and they were dealing with a lack of resources and things of that nature. And so how then when Trump takes office, his main slogan was building the wall, and we saw here in San Diego the building of the prototypes that were faced directly into Mexico, and these were 30 feet high. So these 30-foot high walls continue. Some of them have been. There was roughly a good percentage that was replacement wall. It wasn't new wall that was built; it was replacement wall. But it's still, what we call it here is these are monuments to hatred, monuments to white supremacy, and they continue to have a real impact in terms of pushing the migrant routes into much more treacherous and dangerous terrains like the deserts and the ocean waters. In terms of where Biden stands now, he did sign an executive order suspending any sort of wall construction for 60 days from the date of that suspension. That has gone and passed. There are conversations with the Department of Homeland Security officials about where the construction of border wall might be at this point. We know that there are still some land grabs that are taking place in the RGV in Texas. We know that the land has been completely decimated in areas where they were preparing for border wall construction, including there in Arizona, including here in San Diego County. Specifically in San Diego County, the impact to the Kumeyaay people of the desecration of traditional lands and ancestral lands, many of which they have found human bone remains. And so this was a real impact to the spiritual lives of the Kumeyaay people who have been living here for thousands of years. And that is still an unresolved issue. And mind you that this was a border wall constructed by the Trump administration illegally taking funds from the Department of Defense to build these projects. So I'd like to end this part by saying that one of the concerns that we have under Biden's plan moving forward is that there's this tendency of saying we're not going to build any more wall, not one more foot was the statement that he made to an NPR reporter at one point. But we are seeing the proposal of surveillance technology. And this is the newer sort of trend. It's not that new, but it's the trend that we see that will probably replace some of the much more physical aspects of border wall construction, is the idea of technology and smart borders being used to replace that type of the much more physical, visceral architecture of border wall, where the technology will include companies like Elbit Systems, which I know has towers there in Arizona, which is looking at how to surveil communities. And we see this extending into different areas. For instance, here where I live in the city of Chula Vista, they're continuing to expand the use of ALPRs, which are automated license plate readers. Border Patrol and CBP officials already use this. And so it's a different, much more dangerous in terms of how it'll impact the civil liberties of everyone. And the fact that this will then most likely extend into the interior parts of the country. And what makes it much more dangerous is that there is an acceptance from civil society now through the technology that we use on our phones, that this type of technology is innocuous, it's harmless, it won't endanger anyone, where we know that it certainly does. So those are the prospects that we're seeing under the Biden administration, and the fact that companies meet every year in San Antonio selling this type of technology with the expectation that they will make a lot of money from government contracts. The Biden administration's campaign for presidency received 3 times more money in millions of dollars from these type of surveillance industries, because they expected that they probably would have a much more profitable outcome with the Biden win and with the Biden presidency.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pedro. And I would like to echo the experiences like you all have had in that area of the borderlands, because the situation is not really different here. But also something I would also like to mention is that I think like we have been maybe normalized the use of the idea that this is a war zone. But I would like to say that like the thing is like this is not a war zone. The borderlands is not a war zone. The borderlands are like it's a place that is full of life, it's full of resistance, it's full of culture, it's full like a lot of things, But what we are seeing is a genocide from the United States government against indigenous peoples. What we're seeing are crimes against humanity when we see like all the violence that is going on against asylum seekers, against migrants trying to come to the United States. So that's something that I just really wanted to say, because at least my experience in this area of the U.S.-Mexico border is that some people find it troubling, that these places are seen as these like hostile environments. But it's important to acknowledge that the hostilities started with the United States government.
Mhm.
Hostilities started with Border Patrol. The hostilities started not as part of like the relationship between like people in this area of the country or the border between Mexico and the United States, but it started when the United States started implementing all these white supremacist-based policies, as Pedro shared with us a few minutes ago. So with that acknowledgement made, I would like to say that the wall for us is a materialization of other kind of policies, and in particular, what the wall is a materialization of something that has been called the prevention through deterrence strategy, that it's basically to funnel migration, to funnel transit to like the most hostile areas of the desert in this particular case, or at least in the Southwest area, and in particular in Arizona, like to send people to the Arizona desert to die, literally, And this is a strategy that has been documented not only by organizers, not only by academics, but even by Border Patrol themselves, they have this memo in which they talk about like the measure, or like the only way to measure the success of this strategy is like the more people die, the more successful this strategy is. That's it. So with that for us, it's like, okay, literally the United States is trying to kill people, and with that deter people to come to this country, So with that in mind, it's also important to remember that this doesn't happen only because Republicans want it. Like the construction of the wall, the implementation of the prevention through deterrence strategy, among other situations, are a bipartisan effort. Like this happened with the support of Democrats and Republicans equally, and they both are responsible of the situation we're seeing right now in the U.S.-Mexico border. In the same way, I also wanted to say that with that said, is that the wall that in many ways we're really worried about is, yes, like the physical wall, but we're also worried about something that we call border imperialism, and that other people have called border imperialism, that basically is the expansion of the U.S. southern border from its geographical territory to like other countries. In 2012, Alan Bersin, who was assistant secretary for DHS, said that in a press conference said that the new U.S. southern border is the line that divides Mexico with Guatemala, which is something I mentioned a few minutes ago as well. So with that in mind, like what we're seeing is like if the United States is moving its border further south, the strategies implemented in the border or on its border are also going to move further south. So we are seeing the implementation of the prevention through deterrence strategy in Mexico, and we're seeing that like let's extrapolate the situation, and like here in the United States we have the Arizona desert, but now let's say that Mexico has become like the Arizona desert, with the difference that in the Arizona desert, people die of starvation, they die of like dehydration, they die because of like many other conditions. And it's really easy for the government, for the US government, to wash its hands and say like, well, they decided to come and they look for it, right? And that was it. In the case of Mexico, the violence is seen like in the form of drug cartels, is seen in the way of Mexican immigration officers, but also is seen in the way of US Border Patrol agents or US DHS agents going to the Mexico-Guatemala border and train Mexican officers in strategies like how to recognize migrants. And it's really important to remember that like this strategy of like how to recognize migrants is a really racist training, because literally you have to learn to see who could be a migrant and who are not, and there's like lots of systems of oppression that come with it. So with that in mind, again, just wanted to say like, and I think like maybe this could respond to the question about like how Mexico is involved in this situation, because Mexico has accepted all the conditions imposed by the United States to actually become U.S. guardian, in this particular case. So that's like the wall that I'm really worried about, because we are just seeing how the United States is pushing way further down, and now like we can say that the new U.S. southern border is literally the borders between Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We're seeing how like after the migrant caravans, like all these countries like have placed officers just to stop people trying to leave their countries, and they even have tried to create like these task forces in order to stop like migrants and asylum seekers, and all of them are supported and trained by U.S. Border Patrol. So that's one of the walls we're really worried about. On the other hand, as Pedro mentioned at some moment during his intervention, the other wall that we're really worried about is like the tech borders, like the use of LB towers, the use of drones, and how for many people, like the use of these towers or the use of these drones is less lethal than the border wall, when this is not the case, when this technology is as violent and as repressive, as it could be the border wall. And in particular cases, like, Biden could say that they are going to stop building the border wall, but they're going to keep building this technological wall, and that was a strategy that was also implemented during the Barack Obama administration, and so that's on one way. And the worst part, or one of the worst parts of all of it, is like of all the situation is impunity, because again, I'm not Tohono O'odham, and I'm just repeating part of conversations I have had with people that are part of the nation and identify as Tohono O'odham people, but the impact, we cannot measure the impact that the border wall has had on Tohono O'odham Nation land or on Tohono O'odham Nation people, you know? And again, this was not something that was started by Donald Trump only, but this is something that has been also encouraged or was encouraged by the Obama administration, by the Clinton administration. Again, I just want all of us to start thinking about these strategies not as like, oh, Democrats are this and Republicans do this. It's just like they are all complicit in this system, you know? So we cannot measure that the levels of violence, you know. And more recently, like Tohono O'odham people was fighting as much as they could to defend the Quito Baquito Springs. You know, Quito Baquito is this sacred land, is like this beautiful place in the desert. If you can picture, I don't know how many of you know how the Arizona desert look like, but you know, like you can see like all these places like brownish, kind of dry, and then in the middle of it you have like this beautiful spring of water with tons of animals, just full of life, full of flowers, full of food, you know. And basically people, the Tohono O'odham folks, were just trying to defend that, and they were horribly repressed. They were horribly harassed. They were like arrested. They were pepper sprayed. They were like attacked really badly, you know. So I think that when we talk about the impacts about like the border wall has had on Tohono O'odham people, I don't even really know how to start. You know, it's just really disheartening to see like all the situation, you know. And in the same way, you know, like Tohono O'odham folks have talked about how like LB towers are really going to impact their lives because like like in some areas of the desert there is no border wall, but having the tower there also implies like a health problem, you know. It's a health hazard situation because of the radiation that comes from these towers, you know. Like there has been also like these towers have like incredible cameras that have like these really powerful zooms. So some people have complained about like how, you know, like border patrol has harassed them, you know. And we have a testimony of a compañera who said that that she was crossing through a checkpoint and border patrol was like, oh yeah, this is the, like she was sent to secondary, but long story short, border patrol officer said like, oh yeah, this is the person we saw showering like through this like camera or something like that, you know. Like basically like saying that using LB towers and using the cameras, they're like spying on people in really intimate spaces. This could be just a bluff, but the fact that Border Patrol is empowered and entitled to say something like this tell us a lot about the culture of impunity. And the other thing, something that an idea that I want to mention before I finish this part of my intervention is that it's also important to acknowledge the number of people that Border Patrol has killed. Like over 100 people have been killed directly by Border Patrol officers. And in the last 6 months, we have seen at least 4 people killed by Border Patrol officers in this area of the borderlands. So again, I'm not that worried about the wall, but I'm worried that the United States, and in particular Joe Biden's administration, is continuing with the building of a tech wall with impunity for Border Patrol officers and with the border imperialism strategies that are hurting people. Because yes, maybe a reason why there is less people getting to the US-Mexico border is because literally people are dying in Mexico. Like Mexico, for many activists, for many organizers, has become a graveyard of migrant and asylum seekers. Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, that is like an organization based in Mexico, has said that at least 80,000 migrants and asylum seekers have disappeared in their way to the United States. They have disappeared in Mexico in their way to the United States.
Thank you very much. Oops, yes. Thank you very much, both of you. I have to say that I went to the border area near where Eduardo is a couple years ago, I don't even think it's that long ago. And I was horrified at the amount of surveillance equipment that was everywhere. And I don't know if people know that Elbit is an Israeli company that is sort of everywhere on the border. So anyway, I wanted to mention that if you have questions, to put them in the chat. We'll do, as soon as we're done with the questions that Penny and I ask, we will take those questions. So if I have lots of questions from just the discussion, so I'm sure other people do, so please put them in the chat. So the next question is really, you've started to answer it, which is about the Biden administration and its first 100 days and what it's meant, if there's been changes or if it's more of the same, and so kind of just telling us about that. And particularly, I think, speaking to the refugee cap that they just talked about, and what that means. I couldn't understand exactly what it meant, the change in the refugee cap, and also the role that Kamala Harris is playing supposedly in the migration. So anything that you can think of that you think people would be interested in terms of the changes in the Biden administration. Both of you have talked quite a bit already about it, but it would help. So who goes first this time? I don't know.
I can talk very briefly about the refugee cap, just because I think it's important to make the distinction that refugees and asylum seekers, there's a technical difference between them. And so when we talk about refugees, often it refers to people who are fleeing a country and are in a third country before they arrive in the United States, for instance. And so these are individuals, excuse me, who are will undergo an extensive vetting process that often takes a couple of years before then they arrive in the U.S. Quite different from someone who is seeking asylum and present themselves at a port, or who places themselves in a situation where Border Patrol can apprehend them. And so the refugee cap doesn't have anything to do with people that are arriving at the border. And so I just wanted to make clear that that's a distinction. Having said that, though, I think the pressure from organizations that work with refugees pressured the Biden administration enough where they're increasing the refugee cap. But even the numbers that they're increasing it to, it's quite low. We're talking about 125,000 people was a cap that was used under the Obama administration. So this is which had already been reduced. So this is a minimum number. And I believe the Biden administration is somewhere around 60-something thousand people that they're increasing it to. Oftentimes, the Biden administration, in similar other arguments, will say that this is a consequence of programs that were handed to us that were completely decimated. So if we look at the Department of Human and Health Services, so HHR, which is the agency that handles unaccompanied minors, they also handle refugees. And so Biden administration officials will say that department, that agency was handed over to them in shambles. And some of that could be possibly true. We understand that even some of the contracts that companies had for border construction were not communicating with the Biden administration. So to that end, there's some truth to the lack of clarity, transparency in the transfer from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. However, there has to be a much greater commitment from this administration to ensure that they're upholding the very basic principles for human rights, for dignity, for respect of people that are in a process of migrating, whether that be refugees, whether that be asylum seekers or migrants, in whatever capacity. I'm still not seeing that commitment from the Biden administration. And one of the reasons is it goes down to politics. We are entering now an electoral campaign where many congressional offices will be essentially running for office again, which means that the issue of border, the issue of immigration becomes a hot ticket for them, something that they likely will not want to touch because the Border Patrol and its unions have been able to control the narrative around border. The fact that media around the country will use crisis, will use words like surge, will use words that refer to the border in a demeaning way, that dehumanize migrants, and that this is the prevailing narrative means that the Biden administration has already lost the battle in terms of how border communities get represented. And so as a consequence, then we don't see the policies that we would want to see entertained as proposals that could benefit border communities in general. So that's one analysis that I would want to put forward, and just making that distinction between asylum seekers and refugees. And I know in in normal talk with people, there's a lot of conversations where we say, we call asylum seekers refugees, and that's fine, but that distinction is important in terms of when we use words like CAP, just because that's a specific reference to a group of people that are able to enter the U.S. because they've been vetted, and where asylum seekers then are not part of that process. So I just wanted to make that clear.
So this is a really interesting question, because we particularly haven't seen any changes other than aesthetic changes. At the end of the day, something that we are seeing is just like the same things are happening. Like something that has been really hard for some people in this area to see was was to realize that after like Biden promised that there wouldn't be deportations, and all this stuff. At the end of the day, there have been tons of people that have been deported. And the thing that make things worse is that most of the people who have been deported in the first 100 days of Biden administration have been like people from countries like Haiti or Nigeria, So we are not seeing we're not only seeing that Biden is betraying his promise or like not fulfilling his promise, but also we're seeing a turn, like a racist turn in like all the policies or in many of the policies, We don't really think that situation is going to change more. And actually we're expecting things to get worse. This is just like a really simplistic analysis. But something I was talking to some colleagues is that it seems like Donald Trump didn't have like a strong foreign policy team. He didn't have idea about many other things, of course. But Biden is like a imperialist piece of crap, to say the least. And Biden has tons of experience with foreign policy. Biden was one of the architects of the Plan Colombia. And we all know how Plan Colombia ended. So with that in mind, we are just expecting things to get worse. Also, having in consideration Kamala Harris' background, we are not, basically what we are expecting is just like a situation or like formulas that will aggravate environmental conflicts, that will increase environmental risk, that will fit like the differences between poor people and rich people, that will promote like these models of like drug war model or the gang war model, but not a real change in public security, like we're just going to keep seeing the criminalization of poor people, and we're going to keep seeing the criminalization of folks, so that's something that it's been really disheartening to see after some people were really hopeful of the arrival of this new president, something that we have seen is not is like the increase of detention centers. You know, the construction of new detention centers, the construction of new tent cities. I don't know if you all remember Joe Arpaio, you know, and like the famous tent cities he had in Phoenix. Well, surprise, surprise, here in Tucson, we just had the opening of a new tent city, you know, and these are presented as like humane facilities for people, you know. And I think that the only situation that I'm seeing is that this administration is co-opting language from social movement, and in order to, like, you know, use it to justify the strategies they are doing, you know. But it's really important for us also to acknowledge that, you know, like when we're talking about deportations, we're also talking about family separations, and we're talking about like all the people that has been deported about Biden's administration. We can also think that it's really important sometimes for us to remember that there may be families behind those people deported. You know, that people that has been deported is may be living like children's here, and they may be living like mother, father, wife, significant other, brother, etc. You know, so what we're seeing is just like we're a continuation of like family separation. You know, and I would like to think that things will get better in the future. Unfortunately, the history of Biden and history of Kamala Harris doesn't really give us like like hope for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In the spirit of Wham's motto of never a meeting without an action, I'd like to know what actions can we all take to promote justice? And do you have any action? Do your organizations have any action alerts that we can promote on our Facebook page or our web page?
Yeah, definitely. There is a coalition of organizations and different people that are pushing for, like, you know, different strategies and promoting like different bills. One of them is the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act. That is a bill that is demanding, basically, that demands the United States to stop sending funds to Honduras until Berta's case is resolved, until there is justice in her case, and stop funding Honduran security forces until there is like a change in like human rights. So that's an effort that is already in Congress, and I can share this information with the organizing committee of this conversation, so you can share it with your followers. And more recently, there's been like a proposal, like some senators, I think it was like Merkley, Bernie Sanders, Leahy, Warren, Durbin, and I'm missing other 3 or 4. They created like, or they're proposing this Honduras Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act that will try to implement sanctions against the Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and will try to stop also funding for Honduran security forces. So those are like maybe 2 options that people may have in order to join this struggle, you know. But I also think that it's really important for people, for all of us, to realize that we have to push not only for these kind of bills, but we have to really keep pushing for for the United States to stop intervening in Central America. I mean, to stop intervening in tons of countries in the world, but in particular, and or for matter of this conversation, to stop intervening people in countries in Central America, you know. And I think this is a really key moment in which the anti-war movement has to be present, you know. And when I received the invitation for this conversation, I was really excited because I really think we need a broad coalition of people in order to stop the violent situation we're going through, you know. And and I would like to end this part of my participation just saying, like, also I would like to invite you all to engage with immigrant rights organizations in your community, in your area, you know. I would like to encourage you to maybe prioritize organizations that are led by indigenous peoples, that are led by immigrants, you know. I think it's really important to think about it, you know. And it's really important also to support like trans organizations, LGBTQ organizations. I mean, and I think that's a really present way to actually cause an impact, you know, because we can create bridges, we can create organizing power in order to tear down the walls that are killing so many people today.
Thank you.
I wanted to just add something to what Eduardo said. Just that if you look at the list of co-hosts that we have, several of them are groups that work with immigrant communities, and in particular, Hands Off Honduras, which is part of the Honduras Solidarity Network, has been actively lobbying and advocating for the bills that Eduardo mentioned. So you could go to the website of Hands Off Honduras or contact members of it to get involved in that particular issue. So, Penny.
All right. Pedro, do you have any recommendations for actions that our watchers can take and that we can promote from the American Friends Service Committee?
Yes, and I apologize because I'm on my phone. I can't insert the website information into the chat. But if you do a search, which would be like AFSC Title 42 border, you should get an action alert access or a page from the American Friends Service Committee's page where you can take a direct action and sending a message to President Biden to rescind the Title 42 CDC order. We also do a lot of work around trying to free people from detention. And so if you do a search AFSC Free Them All, you'll see access to our work in trying to get people released from detention centers and trying to present a much more abolitionist approach in terms of how we see the function of prisons and detention centers and that incarcerate people, that cage people up, and draw the connections between the immigrant rights movement as well as the movement to reform the criminal justice system, and in some cases abolish the carceral practices that place human beings in cages. So those are the two that I would suggest, as well as the last point that Eduardo made, which is find out which are the organizations in your particular communities, link up with them. That way you're supporting the local work that is able to support the larger transnational work.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Do you have time for a few questions from the audience? Yes? Okay.
I have a little bit of time. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, the first one that I have here is that we have heard recently that Nicaragua is currently more independent and stable and safer for its people. Do people from Honduras migrate to Nicaragua instead of making the journey to the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really important question because people from Honduras has tried to go to Nicaragua. That's true. And some of the information or something that we're seeing is that also Nicaragua, because of like the U.S. strategies to try to like get rid of the current government and like the current sanctions that we are seeing are in place, they're really careful, so they're really protective of its borders. So we can say that in many ways, people in like it's hard to get to Nicaragua because of all these like migration controls, and because like Nicaragua has like a really tight network of like community security, so it's like when they see somebody that is not from the neighborhood, sometimes they, like they just ask them to leave in like it's just really interesting the dynamics that they have, that Nicaragua has in many ways. And also, but on the other hand, something that it's really important to remember is like many people with the pass of the time, instead of migrating to Nicaragua, they just try to come to the United States. So I think in many ways we can also explain that like people from Honduras coming to the United States just because there is like a family connection here, and in many other ways, also people think that there is no safe place in Central America. And Nicaraguan people, not the government, but Nicaraguan people have said like they have seen like one of the things they have been trying to hard really fight is the arrival of gangs to Nicaragua, and something that was really, really, really interesting for us to see is that in a trip to Nicaragua in 2019, some people like presented evidence that show how like there were buses coming, like Honduran buses getting to the Nicaragua to some borders with Nicaragua, and like literally there were kind of like gang, like not like buses, but like couple of bands coming there, and like they were like basically moving gangs to the to the country, and like like in an effort maybe to destabilize the country. And I think this was like a really interesting situation to see. But sorry, just to go back to the question, people has tried to go to Nicaragua, and there are Honduran people that has gone to Nicaragua, but there is more like the interest of coming to the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Lalo. Mercy, do you have a question?
Yes, this is from one of from the Zoom chat. I was part of a group visiting the province of Petén in Guatemala this summer. The goal of the trip was to understand the best uses of financial public-private aid to help with the causes of migration from Guatemala. What suggestions do you have about this type of support?
I'm not as familiar with that, so I feel like I wouldn't be able to comment on it, with the exception that what I would say, any sort of visitation of that nature, programs that are done in conjunction with groups that are in the countries of origin, be done in the most in the way that most respects the local processes. That it's not just a program that takes away from people who are there, but also where there's a commitment to give back and return, so that there's mutual respect and about how communities are being supported.
Yeah, I think something that is really interesting, and I would like to encourage people to think about when we see these kind of organizations present themselves, is like to see who are the sponsors of these groups. Sometimes we can see that behind these, like some organizations or private organizations that are created to like support anti-poverty programs, etc., we can see like the hands of the United States. We can see that like the USAID is present. We can see like all this, like the State Department is present there. So I would like people just to be really worried about it, because if these like institutions or these entities are present there, I wouldn't say that I would trust them at all. And the other thing is like, it's really, we have to understand that Guatemala has gone through a lot of things, and indigenous communities were almost eradicated, and they're still fighting to survive. And they're resilient, as they're really resilient. So I would say that also, if there is a possibility to encourage some model that is more like based on solidarity than charity, it's important to acknowledge, you know.
Penny, do you see any more questions?
I think we answered the last one. There was one question about, is there any more attempts to reunite families going on at this point? Maybe Pedro, do you have any information about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because there are attempts to reunite families, right? And so that was this past week, there were a small group of families that were reunited. There's a lot of TV reporting about, or news reporting about, those families that were reunited. I think what I find ironic, though, is that while there's a lot of fanfare around reuniting of families, that separation is still taking place, whether it be through the self-separation, as migrants themselves have described, because they are forced to have to make that very difficult decision for their families, or because deportations are still taking place, as Eduardo mentioned. And so we see this quite regularly, that with each, at least here in San Diego, and elsewhere, I would imagine that with each deportation, in many of those circumstances, most people that are being deported are people that have been in the country for a long time and have their families here. And so, here in the San Diego area, we have a place called Friendship Park, which has, under the pandemic, has not been accessible to the public. But in years past, we've been able to push Border Patrol to leave part of it open for a couple hours during the weekends. And we see families that come from all sorts of different places in the U.S., as well as from Mexico and from other parts of the world, where they arrive in Mexico with the idea of being able to see their loved ones from the U.S., and U.S. families seeing their loved ones in Mexico, divided by the primary border wall. And so this is something that has been taking place for decades. And so the question around, whether families will be united, that's why I find it ironic that there's a lot of fanfare, because every single day families are being separated in the different ways that the administration is able to do that, because of either Border Patrol separations and their operations, or because of the ICE activity. Though we have seen a drop in ICE operations in San Diego County, they're still taking place. Just the other day, we got a call that Border Patrol had detained someone the week before. ICE had launched an operation in the city of Poway, where community members there took videos of their actions, and these individuals were dressed were not dressed in uniform, they were dressed as civilians. And so there's a lot of questions about how these operations take place, but nonetheless, they result in family separations. And so it's hard to answer that question without being cynical about what we see on a daily basis.
Okay. I think it's probably close to time that we end, so I'm gonna just wind up with a couple of things. We have a couple of announcements from the Solidarity Committee and the Americas, and then if you have any announcements, feel free to put them in the chat, and we're going to leave the page open for a while so people can copy down anything that's in the chat. So if you have announcements, people can review them in the chat. Let me do the two announcements and then wind up with the ending of our event today. The first announcement is that the Solidarity Committee and the Americas and the Minnesota Cuba Committee are sponsoring a car caravan to end the U.S. economic war on Cuba. And the car caravan is part of national actions that are taking place across the country in many cities, and it's to fight the end of the U.S. blockade against Cuba. It's on Sunday, May 30th at 1 p.m. We're starting the caravan at Lake and Nicollet on where the old Kmart was and the parking lot there, and it will go east on Lake Street. And the other event, the other thing, it's not really an event, is that one of the problems that Cuba has with the embargo is that they're not able to get many supplies that they need. And one of the problems they can't get is Cuba has developed 5 internationally recognized COVID-19 vaccines, but they're unable to get syringes to give them to, particularly to Cubans, but also when they start going into other countries to give the vaccines. And so they need 20 to 30 million syringes. And so groups locally are doing a syringe campaign where we're raising money to buy syringes. And I think we'll put it in the website that you can go to learn about the syringe campaign, and also about the how to donate to it. Any little donation will help, so we really appreciate that. And then to end, I just want to thank both Eduardo and Pedro for your presentations. They were fantastic. I learned so much, even though I have gone to the border but there were many things that you talked about, particularly currently. And I know that Eduardo is posting some actions that people can take in the chat, and so be sure to check those out. But I really want to thank both of you, and particularly Pedro, I want to thank you for being willing to step in at the last moment to when Isabel wasn't able to be here. It's been a wonderful, fantastic event, and so I really appreciate both of you being here. And we want to encourage everybody to take action. That's our thing. So be sure to take action and link up with any of the groups that are acting, that are co-hosts of this event. So thank you. Penny, do you have anything else you want to say?
Just thank you, both of you, for
both of you. Yeah, you're great.
Great presentation.
Yes, just great.
Very, very interesting. So thank you.